we are living in a world where wars are being driven by drones, right? There is also a lot of information warfare. There's a lot of work around cybersecurity. One of the reasons why like younger companies are now able to compete against defense primes is because they're more competitive in offering some sort of these like hybrid warfare capabilities.
Okay, welcome back to Pine Speaker Series. Today we have Christine back to our office at Pine in Singapore because we want to double down on some of the topics that are close to our heart, and we didn't have time for our first episode. So
I just loved it so much the first time.
Episode 2, we're going to talk a lot about defense tech, the role of the government, the data security, sovereign AI. Yeah, welcome back, Christine.
Thanks for having me back.
So let's start with the concentration of defense prime. These are very large defense companies in South Korea, in the U.S., in Europe. Just before today for our interview, I'm just looking at some of the big headlines in Financial Times, such as the Russia's hybrid war is only the beginning. And South Korea just announced the largest military spending in 17 years. So these type of news articles keep coming out every week. Let's talk about this trend in defense. You know, most of the countries around the world are doubling, tripling their defense budget. So let's start from there and probably go into the private companies and defense primes.
Yeah. My partners and I at J2 Ventures, we invest in dual use technologies, right? Every single one of our companies have received either non-dilutive capital or revenue from the government. And this is just true from everything from our telecommunications startups to our gaming startups. I'd say from a VC perspective, when you sort of see the macro trend of nation states around the world doubling and tripling defense spending as a percentage of GDP, we see that as actually like market expanding, right? Like it means that the amount of opportunity there now is for government investment and government funding, government revenue for startups is actually just growing year over year, right? And even now, it's like the United States, despite all of the cuts in other parts of the federal government, the defense budget, right, nears $1 trillion, and the U.S. DoD continues to be responsible for at least 2/3 of the world's spending. So, macroeconomically, it is certainly a time, right, where I think a lot of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley especially are very excited to start companies in deep tech and defense tech. And that is certainly, I can't emphasize this enough. That was certainly not the case when I began my career in tech over 10 years ago. So it's very interesting. I think that it's also like, I'm really excited, Hyuktae, because I know you have a global audience, like an Asian audience, and you also have a perspective from Korea, right? Because it's not like the US has 4 main defense primes, right? We have Boeing, we have Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman, right? And these are basically, we define defense primes as the ones who could basically sell directly to DoD, right? But there are also major players across Asia, right? Like in South Korea, we have Hyundai and we have Hanwha. In the UK, we have BAE Systems. And so one of the things that I think about, though, is the difference in ownership structures between these companies. Like all of these companies are massive. They're all publicly traded. They have huge market caps, usually dual listed on multiple stock exchanges. I know one of the things that I'd love to get your take, though, is the ownership at the top, right? For the US defense primes, many of them started becoming publicly traded, I'd say, probably like at least like 50 years ago. They're very much institutionalized. They have corporate structures, board of governance. And I have this sort of like somewhat controversial opinion, though, that having defense primes be publicly traded can actually stifle defense innovation, right? Because you are creating concentration in the market. You are sort of like capping, I think, the potential for a lot of like early stage or younger, more innovative defense companies, because you're sort of underwriting them for M&A, right? And in some ways, like, when there's really only 3 to 4 major players in the market, like you can essentially control the terms of what those acquisitions are, right? And ultimately, you have CEOs in these publicly traded companies that sort of have a dual mandate, right? Like they have to make business decisions in a way that could optimize for the street, right? Optimize for the share price, optimize for the perceptions of analysts. Yet these, what makes these companies different from their other counterparts is the fact that they affect national security. But Hyuktae, I'm going to throw it back to you because it sounds like for Korea, like Korean defense primes and other defense primes, that might not be the case.
Yeah, so I can speak only for the Korean companies that I know of. Hyundai, Hanwha, they are publicly listed. However, what's distinct about Korean companies are that they have controlling family or their founding family, pretty significant minority shares, and they have an influence on the board level. And I would say the quarterly earning reports matter. However, these families tend to have a longer time horizons. They have probably the next few decades for the new generation. Between now, it's a transition between second gen to third gen, but pretty much a third gen are running the businesses now, and they're in their early 40s. So I would safely think they have about 20, 25 years ahead of them. What's also unique is that both of the third generation at Hanwha and Hyundai are U.S. educated. They have a good perspective between South Korea and U.S. in that regard. But another big thing is that many of them have been domestic players serving the Korean military spending, which is one of the highest in the world as we are facing North Korea and China and Russia are surrounding us. However, the last 3 years, Hanwha's stock is up about 3 times because of all the conflicts going on in Ukraine, Russia. And they have consistently delivered high quality, competitively priced tanks and traditional weaponries to Eastern European countries. I think they're bidding for submarine deals for Australia and Canada together. So I would say all that R&D they have done for the last 30, 40 years are now really paying off. However, going forward, I think they're well equipped to take on this increased budget spending around the world. So yeah, with that, I also wanted to ask you more questions around these U.S. primes as they're publicly traded. What are some good examples of more of a short-term thinking versus long-term? Because from what I understand, they usually generate revenues by winning these government tenders, and by nature they're long-term. But how do you see that long-term contracts being hampered by these short-term mindset?
Yeah, I think their biggest influence is just like kind of what it does in terms of market competition. I also just think like U.S. defense primes are interesting because they actually hold a lot of cash. Like on their balance sheet, right? I think it can range anywhere from basically 5 to 10% in terms of cash held, cash as like a percentage of revenue. I mean, it puts them in a position though where they're always like I mean, and I want to, we do actually co-invest quite a bit with the defense CVCs, right? And sometimes I think these CVCs could be very good partners for younger defense tech companies. But I'd say one dynamic that I am excited about is starting to see less concentration amongst U.S. defense primes because of just the sheer number of venture-backed players that are now coming in, right? Like for a long time, it was honestly just really hard to start a defense prime from scratch. I think companies like Anduril, right, and companies like Scale AI, which were all founded within the last 10 years, were all funded by venture capital, have really proved that wrong. And so it is exciting now to start seeing younger companies that are venture backed starting to kind of become not just a subcontractor, right, to the big four, but starting to kind of become like being able to sort of sell directly to the DoD and helping the DoD kind of expand and access new capabilities. So I find that very exciting. And I'd be curious, Hyektae, if you kind of see a similar trend within Korea, because you guys also have similar market concentration.
Yeah, I think I have not seen that many startups emerge in the defense tech as much as in the US. However, I've seen a lot of emergence around physical AI and automation in manufacturing, because since South Korea is so heavy in the manufacturing. But if you're automating at the manufacturing level, at some point it starts to spill over to the defense side as well. But I think still US really is at the forefront of these, I would say, democratization of defense tech through startups.
I think honestly that's due to venture capital.
Exactly.
Like I don't really think it's like there's some government intervention in the sense that innovative teams like Defense Innovation Unit has made it easier for startups to work with the DoD. But again, just my personal opinion, I think it's actually just the sheer amount of venture capital creating venture-backed defense assets that is enabling kind of the rise of the new defense primes.
Yeah, and that's something that's so interesting to me. Going back to your stats that even globally, 2/3 of the budget is actually by the US DoD. So if you're a Korean VC sitting in Korea and you're general VC, you have to ask the startups that come to pitch to you is like, how big is the market? Usually it's just the Korean defense spending, unless they have a real inroads into the U.S., which is not easy for Korean defense tech companies have inroads into the U.S. unless they meet you, Christine. But so yeah, Korean startups, please reach out to Christine. The market is small, and the venture capitals do not have that much allocation for the defense tech. But I wanted to sort of build on that question a bit more, because in the US we've seen great examples like Andrew. I would say Starlink starts to sort of go into that defense area, as we've seen with Ukraine and Russia war, where the entire internet infrastructure was down and they were able to quickly supply and become a replacement for that. We've seen it as potentially could be a threat to the governments. You're not on the right side of Starlink as well. So how do you see these defense tech ecosystem going? Do you think it'll still continue to grow? As far as I've seen in Korea, I think it's still there's a bit of a growth cap on these defense startups unless they are specifically working closely with the large defense prime companies. But how do you see that in the US?
Interesting. I would say that one of the things about having just so much active conflict in Eastern Europe and the Middle East is it has given younger companies more opportunities to go and deploy their technologies in the wild. I have this running joke that like every defense tech company in Ukraine is a defense prime. like Ukraine actually has, I think there's some insane set. I think at least over 10,000 companies have been built. Like have defense tech startups have come out of Ukraine over the last 3 years, mainly because of necessity, right? And all of them, there's no subcontracting in that context. It is like you build something, you want to see if it works, boom, you just deploy in the battlefield, which is actually more, if you think about that type of like business model and that type of iteration, that's kind of what it's like to build in every other aspect of the private sector, right? You want to build B2B software, you want to build consumer, you want to build a marketplace, you usually build an MVP and you ship it.
Yep.
For a long time, it was actually hard to do that in defense. There really wasn't that much active conflict, right? Where I think young companies felt like they could go out and compete. That is different now. And I also just think
how do these 10,000 companies finance all these productions and deployment?
I think it's a lot of government funding. So government support from Ukraine and also allied nations. Okay. But also, the nature of war has changed as well, right? Like you talked a lot about, Financial Times, it talks about like the nature of hybrid warfare, right? Like this is, we are living in a world where wars are being driven by drones. I think one of the reasons why like younger companies are now able to compete against defense primes is because they're more competitive in offering some sort of these like hybrid warfare capabilities, right? The capabilities that I would say our existing defense primes is not as good at, right? Like Anduril is significantly stronger when it comes to asymmetric warfare in terms of data security, data processing than their defense prime contract. There's this defense prime counterparts. And that's certainly like when we're evaluating companies, like we're not really looking at the capabilities that existing defense primes have. We're making predictions on other capabilities we need that we think a venture-backed company can meet better. And I think that's kind of the opportunity for Korean startups as well, right? Because we know like Hyundai and Hanwha, they already sort of have their kind of entrenched capabilities, but those capabilities do not represent the entire landscape of war that we're moving towards. There is also a lot of information warfare. There's a lot of work around cybersecurity. Yeah,
I want to ask you about another question. I saw the news article from Financial Times just yesterday around London renews pressure on Apple to open backdoor into users' cloud data. And I think a lot of countries are now asking these big tech companies to open up their data or store their data in their own country. Why is this happening, and why do governments need access to these data onshore? And yeah, what are your thoughts on that, given your background with Dropbox? I think it's not an easy topic for normal people on the street to kind of understand why is this happening.
Yeah. So, when Dropbox was founded, I think now almost like 20 years ago, it was just founded really during a period of like openness on the internet, openness when it came to sharing compute resources and cloud resources, and to the point where most of the world was their first cloud storage application was like an American startup. But even at Dropbox, like I think about what was going on in 2017, 2018, like we were starting to see kind of the rise of policies that were more nationalistic and like geography focused, even when it came to data privacy, right? The best example of that was when an Austrian grad student named Max Schrems sued Facebook in the Irish Supreme Courts over the handling, right, of his data, right? And he was advocating on behalf of himself as a European citizen, right? And he was basically saying that what Facebook was doing with his data actually violated the safe harbor provision that allowed the free flow of data transfer between the EU and the US. He actually won. He won. So the Irish Supreme Court said, you know what, we think you're right. And that actually overturned the safe harbor provision and led to what we now know as GDPR, right, which stands for Global Data Protection Regulation. GDPR was sort of that first set of policy that says, hey, EU citizens have a different set of rights like anybody else. It made American tech companies that want to serve EU customers and process EU citizen data, it kind of made them have to sort of offer a new set of rights when it came to things like data protection and collecting consent. And that was in 20, all of that was happening in like 2017 and 2018, right? Now we fast forward 7 years later, right? And I feel like nation states have really doubled down in this direction when it comes to creating kind of like nation state nationalistic level laws around like data privacy. And I think especially with sort of the rise of AI and the need for like compute resources, we're starting to see data centers being built into national industrial policies, right? Where you are seeing, like, we have never lived in a more like federated state, right? When it comes to kind of like data processing, we're seeing a lot of states start pushing for data localization, right? So like, I think a lot of the policies that are coming out of like Saudi Arabia, right? But even some like European countries like Germany is very reminiscent to a lot of the laws that China instated, right? 15 years ago when American tech companies were coming in. They're requiring for their citizens' data, right, to be retained and processed in the geographies, right, in these borders, and which is really interesting. Like, I actually don't have like a strong opinion. Like, everything I'm saying is more just, this is just a trend that we're seeing, and I think only time will tell whether or not it's something that ends up serving these nations, right, and serving the industry as a whole.
I want to ask you a question about cybersecurity war that's going on. So I also read recently that Asahi was hacked, and we are running out of acai beer because the entire supply chain is shut down for this malware attack and ransomware attacks that are asking for a lot of money. And I think it's not just this isolated situation, but we're seeing more and more of these cybersecurity risks emerging, and those that are not prepared risk of these type of sophisticated supply chain distribution just coming to a halt. And it could also happen at a national scale, where also recently Korean government website went down because of the data center fires, but it could have been an accident or it could have been an attack. So what are your thoughts on cybersecurity risks and cyber war, which is a whole different thing than physical war that's happening around the world?
Yeah.
And do you invest in the cybersecurity area as well?
Yes, so we are very, very active in cyber. I'd say about a third of our portfolio is in security. And I also have, like, as someone who has actually worked on security teams in industry, like, I also just have like a very deep love and passion for, for this space, right? But and also like kind of the lived experience of having seen the platforms that I worked for be used as dual use technologies, right? Like, Dropbox was actually a really good example when I think about like the early days of like, being on like the trust and safety and trust and security teams there. We actually had nation state level attacks from Russia because they wanted access to some of the data that was being stored on the Dropbox, right? We also had situations where like the Taliban was using Dropbox to distribute terrorist videos. That is simply just what happens when you are like the world's, at the time, we were free and we were very easy to use.
Are these publicly available info?
I think this is, this is like public, but it's also like, this shouldn't be that surprising, right? Like, what does it mean when you are like the world's largest cloud storage platform, right? And you are free, you're accessible to all these countries. You are dual use. Anybody can, everyone was using Dropbox, and it wasn't always for, good purposes like storing your passport. We've seen it used for nefarious purposes, and you as a platform suddenly sort of you carry almost like the power of, like, you are actually making a lot of like decisions like on behalf of nation states around takedown, around data consent, everything. So It was definitely a really interesting time, and that was actually how that was where I started my career. So now, fast forward over a decade investing in the space. Security is one of those things where I think it's so important, but and I truly believe it's like everybody's jobs, but people don't seem to care that much, right? Like we've had so many big hacks. Like security is like one we've had headlines, right, where we actually do know that like China has sort of demonstrated their ability to to hack the US national grid, right?
Or North Koreans hacking some of the largest
Yes.
crypto exchanges.
Yes,
And
like it's
Bitcoin
happened.
gone.
Yes. Like think about the number of cyber incidents that has already happened, and these are all major, right? Like we have had large hospitals in the United States get shut down because of like 0-day attacks, right? Like these things already happen, and it still hasn't really moved the needle, right? Like we still have hospital administrators probably using like writing their passwords on a post-it and just sticking it out on their computer. Right? I'm just being very realistic here. Like, I think security is still something that, like, where humans, as long as, like, I think humans are part of any type of system, right? Like, I think they will continue to be, like, the weakest and easiest to compromise endpoint. And so, one of the things that I've been really interested in is more around, like, open source intelligence gathering. I can announce this because we just did our big announcement 2 weeks ago. So, we led the seed round in a company called Unit 221B. Unit 221B, first of all, it's named after Sherlock Holmes's apartment. It is basically probably one of the best like cybersecurity threat intelligence teams in the industry. So they have built a community of researchers who infiltrate dark web channels and have created the world's largest database of criminal chatter. So these are, I think what anybody in security will actually tell you is that if you are trying to, even North Korean spies, like if they're trying to do something nefarious, they still like to be social about it. Like people actually like to brag about their exploits, and they typically do it in Discord or Telegram channels. And so Unit 221B has basically convened a bunch of researchers that have basically infiltrated the channels and installed conversation scrapers and have ingested that data into a large repository that you can now, because of AI, right, and because of machine learning, you can actually start building predictive capabilities. It's a little bit like the movie Minority Report,
Yep.
right, but focused very much on the dark web actors. And so you're starting to kind of see, especially, I can't name any of their companies. I actually can share that they are a defense contractor, right? But you could imagine some of the largest Fortune 10 companies in the world want predictive capabilities, right? Instead of just trying to convince people not to click on phishing links,
Yeah.
which, they still do, but sometimes it feels like it's a lost cause.
Yeah.
I think a lot of threat intel and a lot of security teams are choosing to be more proactive. They now want access to the data, to the criminal chatter that might be coordinating an attack, and they just want to be proactive in taking it down. What's also exciting about this company is they work with law enforcement to make sure there's accountability. Cyber is actually, I'd say, one of the biggest difference between like cyber attacks versus the physical counterparts, right, is it sometimes feels like there's less accountability because it's so hard to actually attribute. Like attribution is just very, very hard in cyber, right? Like even if you say China is, Chinese hackers are in the grid, nothing really has happened coming out of that, right? Even if we know North Korea has like hacked a Bitcoin exchange, what has really happened, right? Like has actors been caught? Has there been any, there might not even be like sanctions applied. However, like one of the things that if you can start collecting evidence on it, like one of the things the company does is they actually do work with law enforcement all around the world to basically use this data to build a case that they can then take to court and put hackers behind bars. And their track record is tremendous. Since we've actually announced this deal, their work has been covered by Wired and Bloomberg. They have been responsible for catching the hackers behind some of the biggest attacks in the last decade. So I'm talking about the Snowflake hacker, they caught them, the MGM hacker, the PayPal hacker, the list goes on and on. It was Unit 221B, their team and their data that allowed law enforcement to actually build the case, to attribute it to the right person and take them through judicial processes.
Wow. So they're like white hackers and
They are.
working with government.
Yes. And it's just a very different, right? Because I think it's like the reason why I like to talk about open source intelligence security is this is just a new modality of cyber that is now made possible because of kind of where we're at, just in terms of like AI, LLM predictive capabilities, but also just the fact that like, where we're at in terms of just social media, right? The fact that all of these kind of global collaborative channels existed has actually made a company like them and their capabilities possible.
Yeah. Yeah. If they're writing their plans on a post-it, then it'll be very difficult to catch them.
Right. But when they're bragging about it on Discord, it's more possible.
My last question of tech merging or overlapping with government, which is the topic we've been on today, is the sovereign AI. So Again, AI really just started a couple of years ago as a private companies building these chatbots and then getting better and better at it. Now, there's a lot of talks around nations building their sovereign AI, including my home country, South Korea, now has an appointee that reports directly to the president about AI and AI matters, and they have appointed a consortium of tech companies to build these sovereign AI. So, what are your thoughts on sovereign AI? Does it really matter? What can come out of these initiatives that countries are now leading sovereign AI movements?
Yeah, it's also nascent, right? Like, I have no idea what the societal ramifications of this will be. So all I can do is just try to look for comps in history. I don't even have the imagination right now to really know like what that sovereign AI is going to do. We'll see what happens, right? Like I think sovereign AI is certainly one way for governments to help guardrail or kind of manage whatever baseline truth is, right? Like it is certainly consolidating a knowledge base, right? For a country. I think that as long as there's still like an open internet and there's still access to honestly non-sovereign AI, right? Then I'm hopeful that, consumers and kind of markets will kind of determine what ends up becoming like the best product. And we saw that even with, I'll just use kind of the Chinese internet as an example, right? China did have the Great Firewall, but historically has always been very leaky, right? Like people still found ways to get VPNs and still found ways to get access to, Google and found ways to sort of bypass censorship controls. But in general, it's like, that's certainly not like the direction that I want technology companies, right? Technology policies to head towards. But unfortunately, that is where we are.
Okay, Christine, it was such an honor to have you at our office this week and spend a lot of time with you talking about various different things, just hanging out in general. Is and was your first time to Singapore. Any thoughts on Singapore and any other comments that we left out in today's interview?
Oh, I mean, I love Singapore. It's always been like my dream to come here. And I've just been a student of Singapore policies and programs and governance. As someone who's done civic tech and have led tech team in governments, like it's actually always been a dream to kind of just come into Singapore and simply just use your infrastructure, right? And use your apps and just kind of see what it's like to work in probably like, or to like live and experience like probably one of the most efficient governments in the world. I find it incredibly, incredibly impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I definitely want to be back.